Hi, you're watching BloombergQuint. Without deep emission cuts in the coming decades, the crucial warming threshold of 2 degrees centigrade will be exceeded during the 21st century. A recent IPCC report has warned. Now, the biggest role in cutting emissions will be played by business across the world. Already, trillions of dollars are earmarked ESG only, E being environment, S being social, and G being governance. And these trillions of dollars intend to incentivize and push corporations to rise to this new challenge of ESG. Now, there are many challenges down that road of achieving ESG goals, but the critical one is consistent and standardized disclosures. The International Organization of Securities Commissions, that's IOSCO, is working actively and speedily to address this challenge. And joining me from Madrid in Spain is Acting Secretary General Tajinder Singh of IOSCO. Mr. Singh, thank you very much for your time today on BloombergQuint.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Let me start with the simplest possible question with regards to how is the IOSCO approaching this humongous challenge, which has many facets to it? What are the key tenets that you all are basing your approach on?
Right. I think that's absolutely the context that with which you started is the right one. This is a very, very big task globally, and therefore a key role is to be played, of course, by the industry, and therefore with the industry, it is the financial sector that is going to play a key role here. And therefore, in a way, I think that kind of connects very well to the IOSCO objectives. So IOSCO, or the International Organization of Securities Commissions, has 3 objectives: investor protection, fair, efficient, and transparent markets, and the reduction of systemic risk. So therefore, the system that you were talking about, now, on the one hand, you have investors that are seeking to invest in, as you said, ESG activities. And on the other hand, you have issuers seeking finance. And therefore, but between these two, you have intermediating these, you have the financial markets. And where capital markets are engaged, of course, securities regulators, and therefore IOSCO gets engaged. There are issues with regard to what is disclosed to investors, what is the type of reporting or the disclosure that investors need, because so far they've been engaging with financial statements that use accounting standards. And what we are now looking to do is to have reporting that is on sustainability disclosure. So that's one area that we are working on, and I think we can get a little bit into that conversation. But then we have also the other aspect, which is about asset managers. So the investment community, because that, as we know, there is this demand for these types of products, and asset managers are therefore coming out with products for investors. But that is important as well for us to make sure that the investors there are protected, and that there is proper disclosure from asset managers, and that there is not greenwashing happening there. So that's the second work stream. And the third work stream that we are working on is with regard to ESG ratings and data providers, because that is the type of information that investors need to be able to make their investments. So these are the 3 big areas that we are engaged in, but we can drill down into any of these, I guess, in this conversation.
So far in the last decade or so, or maybe even 2, the process of companies seeking to achieve higher ESG goals was a voluntary one, and therefore, the role of measurement, of ratings, of IOSCO-like commissions, playing an important sort of coalescing function. But if it gets legislated by countries, and then, if every industry, let's say, has a certain minimum emission reduction threshold to meet, then what role will IOSCO or any of these regulators play?
Okay. Well, I think there's a fair bit to unpack here.
Yeah.
So I think firstly, let me be very clear. IOSCO, securities regulators, or indeed all financial market regulators, what we are really concerned with is, enterprise value creation. So what type of reporting do you need to do with regard to enterprise value, which is the type of information that investors need when they need to invest in something? So, the value of a company, et cetera, that is coming from there. On the other hand, there are other issues that are beyond enterprise value creation. And so that is things that can be legislated upon by governments, and that's a different area. It is not exactly the same as enterprise value creation, but that's not completely diverse either. So what we are seeking to do is to have a mechanism that firstly is focused on enterprise value creation, and that is where the regulators are coming together. And I should say that the work that we are doing and the type of interactions that we are having are not just with regulators. You are having also, and what we are seeking to have is a place where there can be an interaction between policymakers and regulators in this broader context. And so that is something that we are definitely having. And the whole process will have a consultation kind of mechanism that does allow inputs to come in with regard to policymakers. But I should say that the global baseline that we are talking about is with regard to enterprise value creation. And there is a meshing between the other things, but what we're trying to do is to make sure that there is not a direct conflict between these types of things, so that there's a baseline that can be used firstly for enterprise value creation, but also that can be used in terms of the broader legislative requirements, etc. And that is something that we think that we will be able to have mechanisms that are able to establish that.
Okay, so now let me come to the critical question in ESG. What part of ESG is measurable, can be reduced to a numerical value? Governance has been a qualitative bit. Yes, in countries, it has been reduced to number of independent directors on board or diversity of board, etc., but broadly still qualitative. And E and S are even more challenging.
Right. And I think that is right, because in terms of what is measurable, if you look at the climate aspect of environment, yes, you can measure a commitment to net zero by 2050 in terms of the alignment with the Paris Agreement. So you can actually see where people are in terms of how well are they aligned with the Paris Agreement or the goals that are there for each year. You can measure S in terms of diversity. So how many women sit on the board of a company, for instance, and G, you already mentioned, yes, it is qualitative, but you can also look at things like the differences in voting rights per share class, or indeed whether the CEO and chairman positions are held by the same person. But it is true that is where the catch is, that the metrics are not evenly established across the different sectors, across E, S, and G. And that is where the work that we are conducting within IOSCO, but together with other bodies that I mentioned, including, of course, the IFRS Foundation, is to develop a set of metrics that investors can genuinely rely upon to measure ESG. So that is something that is forward-looking, that we will be looking to have. And you can see that in the work that is going to happen on climate, that it will have a specific set of industry-specific metrics that has not been the case so far.
So talk us through where IOSCO has reached with achieving some of this. You mentioned, of course, the work with the IFRS and creating a sustainability standards board. You mentioned the prototype that you were talking about late November, December last year. These may deal with issues around environment, social. This sustainability standards board might address that, but I don't know if IOSCO is considering looking at social through a different lens. So what is the progress that IOSCO has made so far? And then we'll delve into some of the challenges that you've already raised and how those may be navigated, both from the regulatory side of view, but also from the compliance side.
Okay. So let's get to that. I think what we have done is, last year has been a very intense period, and this year has also been that. So what we've done is to actually produce 3 reports. Now, I can get into detail on the disclosure one that we published towards the end of June. We've also published a report on asset manager disclosure greenwashing. That's a consultation report in terms of recommendations for asset managers. We've also produced a consultation report on ESG ratings and data providers. So, but let's come to the disclosure issue. And I think it's important to see here that what we are seeking to do is to build on past successes. So it's what we had done, let's say 20 years ago. That was about the establishment of the IFRS itself. the International Financial Reporting Standards, and specifically the accounting standards. So there is an accounting standards board, the IASB, the International Accounting Standards Board. And 20 years ago, that there was similar talk about saying, well, there is multiplicity. Can we get to something that we can have some type of a global harmonization? And I would say that that process has been successful, because there again, it was IOSCO's strong endorsement of the process that actually led to the success of the accounting standard side, and that the IFRS standards are now taken up in 140 countries all over the world. And that has been a significant achievement. And what we're saying is, let's learn from past success and say that, okay, sustainability standards and accounting standards are not the same thing. There are certain aspects of sustainability reporting, especially forward-looking elements, that are not very easy. But that is, you can use a mechanism that has already worked. So therefore, the first pillar, I would say, of what we are doing is to say that let us establish, let there be an international sustainability standards board, or an ISSB, like the IASB, that is set up under the IFRS Foundation, and that the objective of that will be to produce a global baseline with regard to what I was just talking about, enterprise value creation, the information that investors need. Now, with that, what we're saying is that, again, that is something that needs to be unpacked, but I'll do it briefly. There are two aspects. One is that you need to have a very strong content to the standard, and you need to have a very strong governance to the standard. And IOSCO is engaged in both of these, as we were engaged, and we have been engaged on the accounting standard side. And so that is something that we are doing through a technical level work between the IFRS Foundation and IOSCO in terms of looking at the work, the standards that will be produced. And we are already working together with them on content and on governance. The important thing is, like the accounting standard side, where you have actually a 3-tier governance structure. So you have the accounting standards board, and then you have on top of that the trustees of the IFRS that oversee the accounting standards board. But on top of the trustees, you have regulators, because you need to make a connection to the public interest. And that is where you have something called a monitoring board, and that is chaired by IOSCO, and that establishes the connection to the public interest and therefore to trust. And therefore, what we are saying is, let's use the same model on the sustainability disclosure side. So that's one. Then the other thing that we did for the accounting standards was, after the accounting standards were produced, or as they were developed, we, as securities regulators, as IOSCO, endorsed the accounting standards, and therefore that actually paved the way for their take-up globally. As I said, 140 countries. And we are saying IOSCO will work towards a possible endorsement of the proposed ISSB standards, the sustainability side. Then the next element here, or the third element, is about what we call a running start. And that is the thing that I was mentioning earlier, that you have these voluntary bodies that have worked earlier, and people used to talk of an alphabet soup of standards on that side. But then they have come together. And that has been, I would say, one of the very significant successes, that they came together in the public interest to produce the prototype that I was talking about. And what we are saying is that that prototype can serve as a running start, rather than reinventing the wheel. That is a running start. But of course, we will have to then have proper consultations and so on before that becomes an official standard. The fourth element here is about climate first. So yes, I know we talked about S and we talked about G, but even inside E, what we're saying is, let the best, kind of not be the enemy of the good. So what we're saying is that we support a climate first approach in terms of this, because that is an area where there has been quite a lot of debate and discussion already, and the prototype is there. But I will hasten to add that we see a clear demand for the IFRS Foundation to not just stick to climate, but to move quickly into developing standards covering the breadth of ESG issues. So on social and on governance, and I should say that that also is not an area where there is absolutely nothing that has happened. So bodies like the SASB, they've done some work on the other areas, and that again can provide the running start aspect. And then related to what we were just talking about, in terms of how to coordinate with the reporting requirements that countries might have, the legislation point that you were saying earlier. And that's what we're saying is that's a building blocks approach. So the work that we are doing is on enterprise value creation that provides a global baseline, but it is not diverse or disconnected from the other types of reporting requirements. And the last point I want to make here in terms of the work that we've been doing is this intense engagement that we are having with stakeholders, with the IFRS Foundation. And the objective is indeed to have an enhanced prototype. So the prototype that was there on climate last December, what we have set the target for is the COP26 summit in Glasgow in November. Ahead of that, to have an enhanced prototype that is going to be produced by the IFRS Technical Readiness Working Group. Sorry for throwing all these working group names, but that's something one can't avoid here. And then just to complete the picture, you have the IOSCO TEG, the TEG, the Technical Experts Group that is working together here. And so that it's not like something saying, okay, they produce something and then we start looking at it and say, no, this is not fit for purpose. So there is already a close interaction because of the urgency that you mentioned. And therefore, we are looking to see whether it can be a sound basis for an international standard. The prototype last year becomes a refined prototype this year, and then can become the basis for a standard as early as the middle of next year. And then you have the monitoring board that I was talking about that also plays a leading role in monitoring the related governance arrangements. And then just to kind of close it off, I would say that not only we don't stop here, because going forward, the role of auditors is going to be essential, because you need an assurance framework here. And that is becoming already a key focus for IOSCO. So because we are wanting to think ahead of that, because you would need assurance there. And then with respect to capital market authorities that are our members, we are also looking to see how we can help to provide them assistance, technical assistance in terms of enforcement, because ultimately all of this will need to be enforced and will need to be supervised. So that's essentially some of the things that we are doing in this area.
Can you talk us through? I've seen the prototype, I've seen the report. In fact, I've seen all of the 3 reports that you spoke of. But just to sort of demystify this a little bit for our audience, because there will be compliance teams from companies listening to you very carefully to try and understand what they ought to be prepared for, right, over the course of the next few years. What kind of standards are we talking about? What kind of disclosures are we talking about?
One thing I should have probably mentioned earlier is that this is also not starting from scratch. You've one acronym that hasn't yet come up is the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Right. And I think that gives you already a very good basis to see what is it that we are talking about in terms of, what are the types of disclosures. So you would have disclosures with regard to governance. So what is the role of the board in these types of things? So you have governance on that side. What is the role of strategy? Again, so that's an important thing that you would need to have. And what is the action plan that companies make for that purpose? That would be important. And what are the metrics that companies will be disclosing? I think those are the 4 pillars of the TCFD. So governance and strategy, and what's the action plan? And then what are the metrics? In terms of some more of the granularity that you were looking to do, I think we were talking about emissions. But as I said, we can also talk about energy consumption, or we can talk about climate resilience. So, what does the company think in terms of the transition risks? What does it see in the, if people are shifting to more sustainable sources, let's say on energy, then what are the types of risks that it sees in these types of transition? What are the types of physical risks? Because we know that these are the 2 areas when we talk about, in terms of climate. So those are the types of things. Or with regard to, one can say even with regard to effluents, so you can look at, what is the level of, effluents, or what is the water withdrawal, what is the water discharge that happens, what is the water consumption, how is, the management of water. All of these types of things are, because you were asking for illustrations, I think these are the types of things that one can talk about.
The fear, obviously in a situation like this would be, Mr. Singh, that this could become too bulky and too difficult for any investor to either understand or compare within peer group companies or compare within even industries. When you approach the creation of these standards, how are you overcoming this problem?
Yeah, I think that element about this not being overwhelming for either side, for the issuers, for the investors, I think is a really important consideration. And I would say, therefore, the important point here is that this is not starting from scratch. There are already voluntary frameworks that are being followed. And why is that happening? That is because there is a crying need from investors, because it is investors who are asking for this information. And therefore, issuers are already disclosing information using some of these voluntary frameworks. As I was talking about, you have frameworks like I mentioned the SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. The Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. So companies are already using that. So, and that, I think, as for any other standard setting process, there is always a consultation mechanism in terms of stakeholders. And the way that these standards, even the voluntary standards, are today being used by issuers has factored in feedback from them in terms of saying, well, if you're going to make it too bulky, if you're going to make it very difficult for either the issuers or the investors, then it's not going to work. And that has already been factored in. So I think the important point here is that, yes, there might be, you're right in saying that people who are kind of facing it today or engaging with this issue might get scared, saying, okay, what's it that's coming down the line in terms of this huge amount that we may have to disclose? I think, quite a bit of that fear can be alleviated by saying that this is building on existing standards that are already being used. You can look at the disclosures that companies are already putting out in different jurisdictions. In fact, what we are seeking to do is to actually reduce the load, because what was happening previously was that because you have these multiple frameworks, so a company is reporting under framework X, and then someone else says, oh, well, that's not good enough for me. I want you to report under framework Y. And what that was doing was not only, that you were actually having to do, that was the regulatory burden that was coming on them. And what we are seeking to do is to say, let it all come together, but let it not come together in a way that becomes impossible for either the issuers or the investors. So I would really, through you, give comfort to both investors, but especially to issuers, but also investors who have to engage with this information and say that, that this is something that is already happening. All this will do is to make it really come together.
How should issuers prepare in, let's say, the interim, in this 1 year or maybe 1.5 years that it takes for these standards to become a reality and for countries to adopt them, or for securities regulators in different countries to start implementing them? What should companies be doing to prepare? For instance, in India, we already have SEBI that's changed the business reporting, the sustainability reporting requirements, and asked for much more detailed disclosures. It is yet to culminate or become, a reality, in the sense that there is a timeline required. But what should issuers be doing?
Yes. What issuers should be doing is to engage with the process that is currently going on. So issuers, because there will be a global baseline, that is without doubt. And that is the global baseline that will be used in different countries throughout the world, because, as I said, IOSCO, there is pretty much unanimous support for that. And so, therefore, look at things like the prototype. The issuer can already look at the prototype and say, okay, there is a very fair chance that a large amount of that might actually become the standard. So that already allows you to engage with the prototype. But I'm saying not just for the climate standard, what the prototype does. And then, as I said, the refined prototype will be there, by before November, before the COP26. So that gives you even a higher degree of, kind of saying this is how the final standard might look like. But that's not just on that standard. It is also the way the presentation standard, not the specific metric, that we're talking about the climate thing, not only is that helpful, but the issuers can engage with the prototype to see how the presentation standard will look like. Okay. How that, because it also sets a template for subsequent standards in other S and G areas also, because that provides that type of template. And there is also a conceptual guideline. So that's one thing. The second is that all over the world, because I'm not being very specific about a country, there's already been quite a bit of take-up of the TCFD framework, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. That is a voluntary framework that has been voluntary take-up of that. And again, what I can say is to provide comfort by saying that the final eventual standard is going to be aligned, is going to be built on the TCFD framework, because TCFD is part of the alliance that is coming together. So there is an issuer who is already engaging with the TCFD should find it not very difficult to meet the final standard that is going to come. And I think the last point that I would say is that the issuer should also support the global process that is happening, because the harmonization of requirements is going to be in their own interests as well, because it can mitigate, as I was saying, the reporting burden in many countries and avoid fragmentation. So I think there is quite a bit for the issuers to do, to look at what is going on, the types of public consultations that are going to be out there, the existing frameworks that are there. And if you're already using a framework like the TCFD, then I think there is a high degree of comfort that you get that it is not going to be completely on a different track from there. Or indeed, if you've looked at the prototype or other voluntary frameworks, then there is a certain degree of comfort that we are seeking to provide by saying, this is not going to be just on a clean sheet of paper. So there is quite a bit that the issuers can engage with as they're looking at how the story is going to unfold further.
Okay. The second stakeholder in this whole process, or the second, important critical point of view, is the raters, right? You've spoken about how there are rating agencies also that are trying to bring commonality to the table, so that rating shopping doesn't take place, so that there isn't too much divergence in what ratings look at, and so that investors have standardization. How far are we from some sort of standardization there?
Yeah. So again, on that, I would basically say that let's look at the consultation report that we published. It's not been it's been very recent, the 26th of July.
The July, yes, yeah.
26th of July, and what we have sought to do there is to indeed look at this ecosystem, because this is, yes, there are parallels to rating agencies, but this is not exactly what a CRA used to do. And you have not only ratings providers, but data products providers as well. And what we've seen is that there is quite a bit of multiplicity there, and you can have also inconsistencies in terms of what comes out. So what we have sought to do is to have recommendations with regard to some of the basic practices that ratings agencies, that ESG raters and data products providers should have. And we have therefore a series of recommendations in terms of how they should be engaging with that. Of course, it goes back to the very basics of regulation, because what you're seeking to do is to have due diligence in what you do and avoid conflicts of interest in terms of what the other activities are. But there is quite a bit of guidance that raters can also use to be able to get there. And I think it is an important aspect, because it is important for regulators, because there is many of these are probably beyond the regulatory perimeter. So in many cases, the regulators will need to probably go to the legislature, or depending upon the country, and say, well, I need powers to regulate these types of market participants. In some cases, they may already derive from the existing acts. In some other cases, they may actually need to have. And therefore, what we have done is to say that you need to start engaging with this sooner rather than later as a regulator. And if you need those powers, you should go and get them. And that's also a signaling to the industry that is there, that that there is more likely than not going to be regulation in terms of how you provide these types of products, because they are important, as you said, for the other angle, for the investor. And therefore, that's really what's going to happen.
Mr. Singh, assurance you spoke of, we're going to need a whole new class of auditors to be able to achieve this, because the traditional chartered accountancy firms are not equipped to actually audit compliance with sustainability standards or social standards?
Well, I think the interesting thing here is that because of the work that has been going on, and there has been also an engagement with the accounting profession, with the audit side of things as well. And therefore, I can tell you that the profession, and indeed, the thing that I did not cover was not only do we have a role with regard to accounting standards under the IFRS, but we have also a role, IOSCO also plays a role in terms of the audit standard setting process as well. And therefore, there is already an engagement that is going on in terms of how that is going to happen. To answer your question directly, the good news here is that the audit profession is already engaging with this. So it is not the same thing as auditing a financial statement. It is different, but the good thing is that the audit profession, and there's quite a bit of interaction that we're already having with the profession there in terms of how do you actually engage, what are the specifics.
Sorry to interrupt you there, sir, but do you expect that the current firms that actually provide assurance services for financial reporting will also be able to do or provide these services for, let's say, sustainability reporting?
Yes, I think so. I would not absolutely rule that out, because that is the engagement that I was talking about. There is already interest for them who are doing it on the accounting side to also do it on the sustainability side. So yes, I do see that they should be able to play a role here. That doesn't mean that there is no field for others to come in, but I think there is a role they can play.
Okay, so in the final scope of this conversation, Mr. Singh, it occurs to me that over the next 2, 3, 4 years, we are going to be sort of awash with new standards, new compliance regimes, new regulatory frameworks, new entities participating in this entire process. And all of this is going to happen in as tight a timeline of maybe as starting from later this year to 2024 or 2025. Is that a fair way of describing what's coming our way?
I think it is. And that is what makes it so exciting.
I think you've set the note right. And I don't believe this will be our only conversation on this. I do hope we can keep coming back to you for better understanding and for better guidance over the course of the next few years as we deal with this at an international as well as local level. Thanks very much for drawing a very clear picture of what to expect over the course of the next year or two and how it will be implemented. Thank you very much for your time here today.
Thank you, Menaka, for the opportunity. I think it's always good to be able to talk, especially to people in India, about what is happening internationally, because it affects everyone. So thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Mr. Singh.
Thank you.